Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this July 3rd, Thursday evening. I'm Jose Sosaya in the Wave Now studio. Joining us again, thank you for this latest edition of Wave Extra, whether that's on your Wave Now app, on your smart TV, on all our social channels. Always appreciate you making the time to connect with us as we sort of digest the big stories of the day. In fact, we're actually going to do things a little out of order for tonight. The reason being, I want to let you know what we're digging into and sort of really honing in on for Wave News at 11, which, by the way, again, another night, we're grateful to have meteorologist Ryan Houck in for chief meteorologist Kevin Harned. But this is the story Logan Perone is working on for tonight, and has to do with something we let you all know about earlier this afternoon. And if you've been following perhaps the controversial back and forth with this data center idea, the proposal up in Oldham County, well, in the end, the developer behind the proposed data center is no longer moving forward with the plan. So you can say, for now, this version of a data center, it's scrapped. So this follows Tuesday's vote, which we were there for to cover. It imposed that 150 days, so give or take those 5 months, but a moratorium essentially on all data center development. And that included the company involved with this proposal pitching the idea, WHP, standing for Western Hospitality Partners. They wanted to build a facility at the Sauerbeck Family Drive-In, and actually that was a site that was then chosen as an alternate from the initial proposed site that WHP had pitched to county leaders. WHP's decision, by the way, follows fierce pushback from people across the county. So I want to give you an idea, of course, of what that looked like. If you're wanting a reminder of what the site is, this would be where it would have gone at the drive-in movie theater. So today, county leaders say they do plan to move forward with creating guidelines for data centers in the short and long-term future. And at a press conference today, Judge Executive David Vogel talked about the future of the county, and he also took questions about a May 22nd meeting that apparently was not open to the public, and that seemed to have caused more frustration for people who came to this Tuesday's meeting. So, again, our reporter, Wave News' Logan Perone, pressed Judge Executive Vogel on the legality of that meeting. I want to show you what he had to say.
Of the members of any public agency, which they did determine you guys had at that meeting, at which any public business is discussed or at which any action is taken by the agency shall be public meeting open to the public at all times. You previously told me that this was a legal meeting. Do you stand by that?
Well, I can't, I'm reluctant to comment on anything that's before the Kentucky Attorney General. I don't want to get crossways with them or myself, or, it's complicated, I would say. We have nuances here that I just don't want to venture out into that. They're investigating the circumstances that have been presented to them, and we'll wait for their determination to hear if anything inappropriate occurred. And
I'm sorry, David, I just want to say, you told me that you said it was a legal meeting. Do you stand by that?
Do I stand by it? Well, I'll say it was a meeting, and no one in the meeting anticipated that anybody would find something wrong with that meeting. Our county attorney was in the meeting. No one had any thought that there was something inappropriate about that meeting. It was a business meeting with people who wanted to do business in Oldham County. Business meetings with people who want to come to your county are very common. I mean, people come all the time and say, we'd like to do this, we'd like to do that. There didn't seem to be anything inappropriate about it to us. It certainly wasn't anything that anyone was trying to do anything inappropriate with.
And so there you heard Judge Executive Vogel's answers to our Logan Perone's questions. Now, Logan, of course, distilling the report to get you the latest information again tonight on Wave News at 11. Logan also talked to some people in downtown LaGrange this afternoon, and then you're also going to hear what those residents had to say about this particular development again. So stay tuned for that tonight. Wave News at 11. We'll share that, of course, on wave3.com, our app, which, of course, you can download and get all the latest updates through that venue as well. So what we're going to do as we move forward with tonight's edition of Wave Extra for today's, or the usual tonight breakdown of testimony from our reporter in Bowling Green for the Houck and Lawson trial, and of course then our legal analysis. What we're going to do is get you to that pretty quick. So what we're going to do is take a quick commercial break, reset on that, and then bring you that commentary from our Wave News legal analyst, Leland Hulbert, and of course, our reporter inside the courtroom, Alina Noakes. So if you stay with us, we're going to take a quick pause here and be right back with that commentary from them on Wave Extra. All right, welcome into this segment of Wave Extra tonight. Checking in, of course, as we're rounding out the week, heading into the holiday weekend with our reporting crew down in Bowling Green following the trials, respectively, of Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson. And today, I'm getting to hear, again, more testimony, layers of it built up by the defense, pointing to some expert testimony, a couple discoveries that the defense had brought up, and of course the prosecution's chance to rebut some of what they've been saying, and of course with all of the context that she's been able to provide us throughout the week ever since the start of the trial is Wave News reporter Alina Noakes. And as I bring in Alina, I wanted to ask you up until this point, so here we've had a lot of people who perhaps wanted to follow inside the courtroom from when we saw Steve Lawson go to trial. We come into this chapter of it, presumably a lot of people who still have ties to, all of the characters involved in the case. I just wanted you very quickly, for the folks who are watching this tonight, put us inside what's been the general demeanor as the days have gone on of the audience, of sort of the mood coming in and out during the day. How would you describe that?
Yeah, I think it's been a roller coaster for a lot of people, depending upon, of course, what side of this you find yourself on. So both prosecution, witnesses, victims have been in that courtroom. Of course, the entire Ballard family, they have a very strong showing of support. They had that in the Steve Lawson trial, and here you've probably seen video of that as well. Them dressed in bright pink. That's the color they used to honor Crystal Rogers. And then, of course, in this trial, unlike the Lawson trial, there are several defense Houck's family members in the courtroom, not people who have been accused as co-conspirators. People like Rosemary and Nick Houck have not been in the courtroom, but it's still very intense because we do know there's been a bit of history, obviously, in the 10 years between the families involved in this. So there have been moments where it's been a little bit maybe more uncomfortable, especially in the hallways. Understandably so that would be the case. But of course, as the evidence gets produced is what we really like to focus on here. Again, a roller coaster of emotions as they hear some things that have been very triggering for families, like the Anna Whitesides find inside her car with the strand of hair to be found similar to Crystal Rogers. That was something new the Ballard family had not heard before, and really caused them to have an emotional reaction to it. And then, of course, we had the defense testimony yesterday with Rhonda McElvoy that kind of did the same sort of thing, but a different side of that. They hadn't heard some things before, or just hearing her take the stand in general and talk about Houck and how that relationship was with Crystal and the family was something I don't know how they really reacted to it necessarily, but you know, when you're in a case like this, you don't necessarily want to hear from the defense side. You want to hear as much from the prosecution as you can if you're the victim's family. So, you know, it's just been a roller coaster for them as they consider all the evidence and consider what the case holds. And but ultimately, you know, no matter what they think, it's going to be determined by what the jury thinks in this trial, Jose.
For sure. And of course, here was another day, Alina, where they're having to, you know, at least take into consideration what these defense expert witnesses are at least offering up as their expert opinion. And why don't we start with one of those expert witnesses that was brought up, the cognitive psychologist, and in particular, you know, their comments on two of the witnesses who prosecutors have brought up and their connection to both Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson. I wanted to ask you, Alina, what perhaps, you know, stood out to you about the comments that they were making? And then in turn, it seems the Commonwealth, the prosecutors were able to sort of put that into further context, you know, sort of providing the answers that a jury, that you'd argue that the prosecutors want the jury to also keep in mind as they're mulling all this over, right?
Right. So I think that was a big point of emphasis for the prosecution with that defense expert, specifically when you were thinking back to when Charlie Girdley and Heather Snellen, the two people in question here, gave their testimonies. At the very end, even after the defense cross-examined, brought up the way their stories evolved and how they went from saying they knew nothing to then confessing ultimately to the involvement of, you know, Lawson's and the Houcks that eventually led to their indictments. They had a lot of pushback from the defense, but ultimately the prosecution would get up after both of them and say, but the statement you're giving today, is this the truth? You know, take everything else that's been said aside, is today what you're saying to this jury the truth? And they'd say, absolutely, it is. So taking that into context, that's something that the prosecution really wanted to emphasize today, even though the defense witness really kind of tore into the tactics of KSP, specifically their interrogation tactics, which the prosecution also kind of, you know, questioned him on, because he said, isn't interview tactics and interrogation tactics different in the way that you would do things? And he admitted that it was. And in this case, it's kind of you know, with an interview, it's a little bit different. And so he's sitting there talking to Charlie Girdley and Heather Snellen, and the defense expert says that these KSP detectives, in doing so, use tactics that would be deemed, you know, something they wouldn't do. Inappropriate, coercive, trying to get people to say things to match your version of events, but they might not necessarily have remembered, or might not be what they, what the truth is. So things like promising leniency for things, or giving them facts that they maybe didn't know but are suggestive and they take it as truth, things like that. And he actually counted that there were about 315 times that those tactics were used against Charlie Girdley in what ended up being about a 4-hour interview, and 350 that were used against Heather Snellen in what was a 4-hour interview as well. So both, of course, producing testimony that was against both of these defendants in this case. And just to recap that, being that Charlie Girdley said that he was with Joseph Lawson when he got the keys to Crystal Rogers' car from Brooks Houck that night, July 3rd, and that Joseph Lawson later called him on the Bluegrass Parkway to come pick him up because he had broken down. And then Heather Snellen testifying about overhearing a conversation between the Lawsons about discussing moving Crystal Rogers' car on the Houck family farm. So all these things taken into account, you know, at the end of the day, it's the believability of that witness, and that's what the defense tried to do today, is put that in the jurors' minds that maybe they're not as credible as the prosecution would like to think that they are, and would like you to think that they are. But ultimately, you know, when they take the stand is the moment that really matters as well. So it's going to depend upon what kind of value they give to that expert witness in this case.
And perhaps you'd argue, Alina, the same would apply to this former LMPD officer who they brought in. It seems, you know, his background being a homicide detective, and Officer Butler. And the defense trying to, you know, point out, again, sort of this is the you know, not the one-trick pony per se, but just in hammering the point home about the physical evidence. And it seems like they were discussing all these different other searches where there's been nothing so tangibly linked to it all. But was there anything discussed in Detective Butler's testimony as far as searching was involved in the process that stood out to you? Because again, the prosecution had an opportunity to sort of put, other nuance into context, right?
Right. So I think the big thing with this case, Jose, is ultimately it's a circumstantial case. The prosecution admits that much, except they have all of these confessions and people saying that they overheard these things or heard these things directly from the Lawsons and the Houcks. So it's things like this that really kind of put the context into Detective Butler's testimony today, specifically that he was testifying about a review of the case and all the searches that the FBI and local law enforcement has done over the years, and what those searches ultimately revealed. And when it came to like confessions and interviews, he had only done those in portions, and of the ones he reviewed, he didn't really testify too much to. So, he was mainly looking at the evidentiary side of it, specifically the lack of trace DNA and DNA in general, or trace evidence and DNA in general, as well as no skeletal remains, and kind of going through that process and his perspective as a homicide detective. And prosecutor Shane Young, who's worked, at least it seems like it from the conversations he had with him on the stand, has worked with this Detective Butler before, kind of pointing out how homicides are not all the same. Looking at these things in isolation can be pretty easy to do, but when you put it in the context of everything else, there are certain variables that can impact every single homicide case. He actually recalled to him a homicide case they did in Louisville, at the homicide that happened at Bashford Manor, that resulted in no trace DNA and no body ever found. And so it's things like that that he says, just because trace DNA doesn't exist does not mean that the crime didn't happen at that location. Basically, things like that, just trying to prove that, just because something doesn't exist there doesn't mean that it didn't happen there. And so, specifically with DNA being something that obviously was tested a lot in this case, from the hairs found in vehicles to, the clothing that was found underneath that one driveway at Woodlawn Springs subdivision, that was a big reveal today. Even it had no DNA, but it wasn't that it didn't have DNA that excluded or included Crystal Rogers in it. It just that it didn't have it at all, which is, interesting. And so it kind of gave the jury questions about that as well, because first of all, it's an odd spot. You find clothes underneath a driveway of a subdivision that, in this case, Houck helped develop at the time that this crime happened. So it's things like that that gave the jury some questions about, at the time when this was July 3rd, it was rainy. Many people have testified that it was a really rainy day and night on July 3rd. So would that have impacted how trace evidence holds up? And through the seasons, they asked about snow. Does that impact how evidence or DNA holds up? And, it kind of put Detective Butler in a position to say that it can impact it. It can dissolve trace DNA, and it can make trace evidence rather, and it can make DNA unusable. So these are things the prosecution really wanted to highlight for the jury, that homicide cases are not all the same, and just because it's unlikely that it would happen doesn't mean it's not likely at all. So that's kind of the direction they chose to take Detective Butler's testimony today.
Okay, of course, all the context, and, should remind the folks at home, Alina, that it seems the jury's going to have at least the extra day, given it is a holiday tomorrow, to kind of mull things over. Any final words that the judge gave to folks before, court wrapped up for the day, or are we just sort of hoping to watch the process continue in earnest when we come back on Monday?
No, he really just said the same thing he always says, that admonition, which is, don't discuss this case with anybody outside of this courtroom. Keep your thoughts to yourself. You're only going to discuss it when you go back for deliberation. Obviously a big thing to do on a holiday weekend. A lot of people going out and doing things with friends and family, and, people may be wondering where you were for the last 2 weeks. So he really emphasized that's something they can't do, and don't be looking at media coverage or any of that. But it does kind of give, they have 3 days now to consider the evidence they've heard, and then they'll have Monday to hear some pretty lengthy closing arguments, we believe, at least an hour likely from Lawson's attorneys, and 2 hours of closing arguments from Houck's attorneys. And we didn't really get an estimation on the prosecution, but you can expect it to be a little lengthy as well. Closing arguments is the final time this jury can hear things in summary. So that's something that's going to be a big emphasis, and I'm not surprised it's going to take a little bit longer. They're going to try to tie all this together for them. So that's kind of where things lie. 2 weeks in, that's a lot of evidence for this jury to consider, and I'm sure it'll be on their minds this holiday weekend for sure. And two, the date specifically, it's been emphasized so much. This is July 3rd. This is the last day that Crystal Rogers was seen alive. This is the last weekend that 10 years ago that has been playing over and over and over again in this trial, July 3rd to July 5th. So, I mean, at least if I'm a juror, I may be thinking about that for sure. And, these cases hold a lot of weight at the end of the day, as they should. So if I'm them, I'm definitely thinking about this in the context of the weekend itself, and what that decision is going to ultimately be come next week.
I think you would be right in saying sort of a poignant reminder of, the calendar date and what this has meant to the community, at least for those who've followed this case as closely from the outside as we know a lot of people have. So, of course,
I'm sure it's hard for the entire Bardstown community. I mean, one thing we haven't seen as much in this courtroom is representation from the Bardstown community, but it's not because it doesn't exist at all. It's just that the family, it's a small courtroom, its space is limited, and they've asked for supporters to not come crowd the courtroom so that whoever wants for the family to be there can have enough seats to be there, and they've been able to. So we know that the Bardstown community is paying very close attention. Really, I mean, a lot of towns in Kentucky that have been invested in this case over the last decade have been paying very close attention to this trial, and I know the Ballard family for sure feels that. And of course, at the end of the day, they just want a resolution, and they want to find Crystal. So that's something that everybody's kind of keeping on their minds throughout the duration of this trial.
All right, excellent. Our Wave News reporter, Alina Noakes, for us has been there from the very beginning, not just for this Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson trial, but of course dating back to Steve Lawson's involvement and eventual conviction in that particular case. But of course, heading into the weekend, we'll have that break, and come Monday, Alina and the rest of the crew will be there to of course, break down those closing arguments for us, whatever the judge instructs the jury to do. A reminder, you can always follow all of our multi-layered, in-depth coverage on our app, on our website. You're going to find Alina's thorough reporting on there as well. Alina, thank you for your time as always.
Of course. Thanks, Jose.
checking in with our legal analyst, Leland Holbert. Leland, again, thank you for making the time to check in with us. Of course, here we are on Thursday before Independence Day, the defense resting, and we heard a little rebuttal after that, but I'll get or start in the point where we heard today's first witness call from the defense, a psychologist that they brought in. I'm curious, Leland, it sounds like, this psychologist really wanted to hone in on questioning at least the sincerity of the testimony you heard from Charlie Girdley and Heather Snell. And I'm just curious, I always ask you this question, the rationale from the defense doing so and the points that this witness was making. But obviously the prosecutors then having a lane about, I guess I would describe it as the stress of those interviews regardless, right?
Right. Yeah, I think the defense is just trying to show that the interviews were coercive. There are some things that stand out about the length of time and the questions asked and the patting on the shoulder and sort of promising them things. But, the prosecution is going to fire back with that doesn't mean they weren't telling the truth. It just means that the interviews lasted a longer period of time. So, they now have 3 or 4 hired experts that they've paid a substantial sum of money for. And I think they're getting their money's worth because they're trying to cast reasonable doubt on the investigation of the police, which they're they're somewhat easy target because it's a 10-year-old case. People have changed their stories multiple times, and some investigators have made some mistakes. So I think that them calling this type of witness is not a surprise.
I was going to ask you, and perhaps would you say it also isn't a real surprise to have brought in the former officer? And I guess the line of questioning or the conversations around him were again much more so about evidence processing, and maybe that's just a very broad term to put it. But what stood out to you as far as the note or the points that this former officer was making and the questions he received from the defense?
Yeah, it was Detective Butler. I had cases with him when I was a prosecutor, and anytime you have a former homicide detective and you're trying to attack what the police did in this case, you can ask the officer or detective, what should they do? What did you do in your cases? What did they do incorrectly? And I think he hit on some points of how they made some, or how he believed they made some mistakes. And the truth is any investigation is difficult. And presumably I don't think anyone denies that someone killed Crystal Rogers. And anyone who did that is going to try to hide the evidence. And how well can you hide it and get away with it without leaving DNA traces was kind of the main argument, with the defense wanting to point out there were 50 to 100 different things looked at that produced zero palpable evidence. And then you have the prosecution trying to say, well, does that mean she wasn't murdered? Well, of course not. But it doesn't mean that the prosecution has a mountain of physical evidence. And I think that point has been hammered home through all the defense witnesses, that the prosecution's evidence is either somewhat limited or somewhat flawed, and that's their theme. Now, the prosecution can argue the reason that is because they're trying to hide this. This is a family who worked together to try to hide a murder, and that's why there's not much evidence. And I think closing arguments will go along those lines of the defense saying they just didn't prove it. There's not enough evidence. You can't send someone to prison for murder and convict them because there's just not enough evidence. And the prosecution can say, well, there's a reason there's not enough evidence, because they hid everything. They're skilled. They planned this out. There are multiple people. It wasn't just a one-man shoddy job. It was it was a scheme that had multiple actors. So it's two sides arguing the points that we probably could have predicted from the beginning. But the defense is not just sitting on their hands. They are paying witnesses and calling witnesses to say what they believe happened.
And to just one little side point to what you mentioned about the limited nature of the physical evidence, it sounds like if we were to try to summarize perhaps what the prosecution's brought up, the limited aspect of the hair, of the white car, of the dog that was brought in with that separate handler, and of course then the rebutting witness to talk about the training he did or didn't recommend for the dog, would you think, that's the limited scope we've seen up to this point, pretty much?
Yes, I mean, I think you're going to have a closing arguments where the defense is going to argue the lack of evidence and the holes and just try to throw reasonable doubt wherever they can. And does it meet the threshold? Does it pull the prosecution's case down below that reasonable doubt line? And then you're going to have the prosecution probably do similarly to what they did in the first trial, which is tell a story and tell, why people shouldn't get away with things and how Crystal Rogers's family is, brokenhearted and why this happened and offer reasons. And so then the jury's, my guess is you're going to see a pretty good deliberation, although they will be thinking about things this weekend. And like I said, they may help make up their minds somewhat prematurely. So a lot of times when you're in the thick of things and you hear from a witness and then all of a sudden closings start 30 minutes later, you're just sort of all wrapped up in it. Now that they get to take a pretty substantial break, what does that do to them? Does it mean that they see more holes? Does it mean that they start reading articles or talking to family like they're not supposed to? Does it mean that they think that they're both guilty and they're making their minds up? And the whole point of saying all that is I have no idea what they're thinking. It's just that the closing arguments may not be as powerful as they would be if they had them right now.
I was going to ask you about, well, and this may not have anything to do to impact the overall picture, but just there was a note, and maybe you're reading it from when it got from what Alina or Christy had sent. So is a jury, how much do you think it sinks into a juror's mind if the prosecutor's exchange when talking about Detective Butler, and you mentioned you'd worked with him in some cases, but there was kind of this comment written in the notes about how implying in cases he'd been involved in about dismissal cases. Do you think that's just the prosecutor doing his or her job, and because that's public knowledge? Or I guess if you're going to try and do the best you can for your case. I just thought that line it stood out to me, that note.
Well, you have people that were all the two defense attorneys for Houck and the two prosecutors have all been prosecutors in the past, and they all probably know of Mr. Butler's cases. So presumably, since he's testifying to an expert type opinion, the prosecution knew he was coming, so they did some research into cases they've had with him or cases that he had, and I'm sure he did have some that were dismissed, and that's just the way it goes. And from my knowledge of him, he's skilled in the courtroom. He's got some jury likability because he's been doing this for a long time. He's had high profile cases before. And when you're a homicide detective, you do have to go through a lot of different evidence processes. So he's going to know more about those types of processing and what it takes to make a bigger case than anyone on the jury, obviously, and probably more than a lot of the people that are testifying. So the question is, did the prosecution do enough to poke holes in his testimony or steer him back to saying, yes, you're saying this, but does that mean Crystal Rogers wasn't murdered? No. I mean, obviously he can't, if he's going to maintain credibility with the jury, he can't sit there and say, I know what happened, because he doesn't. So I think he's going to walk the line of doing what he was paid to do and find the holes in the case. But he's also, if he wants to maintain credibility, he has to say that other things are possible as well. And I think that's the theme with all the defense paid experts is they do have to admit at the end of the day that there are alternate possibilities. And if they don't admit that, they lose all credibility.
I wanted to ask you because, and this might be the way we'll wrap up for today, is you mentioned how, over a long weekend, you might have jurors just have more time to sit and process, or if they get bored, they may not reveal what they are or looking into. But given heading into the weekend, for you in your practice, over a weekend's time, are there any big or even small changes to how you're going to approach the closing argument? Or even like heading into a weekend, it's like you've prepared it for so much time beforehand that not much is going to change once you come into the courtroom on Monday?
I would expect with this group of attorneys, you're going to see probably exceptional closing arguments because they have 3 more days to work on them. Trial is a grinder for any attorney, and you can prepare and prepare and prepare, but most people don't write their closing until the week of trial. I mean, if you write a closing 2 or 3 weeks before trial, I don't know what good it does you because your closing is supposed to be a building block of what happened at the trial. So usually you would write it the night before, a couple days before, or you'd start piecing it together during the trial. And the attorneys know the case so well, but now they get 3 days to prepare as best they can. So I seriously doubt they're just going to take the 3 days off, go on a boat, and relax. They're going to be working hard. You'll see some excellent points and excellent closings, and the jury will be left with the case after that.
Let's see, anything else from the notes stand out to you this afternoon? I was going to say, we kind of got an impression of what the instructions will be come Monday and then Tuesday. Does it make sense to want to sort of give it that time and breathing room for Monday coming back?
I think it's a tough call for the judge, but I think he was doing what most judges would do. You can't force the jury to hear closings. They all have weekend plans, I guarantee you, and you can't just make them stay there for days when none of them want to be there on a holiday weekend, even if they're doing the best civic duty they can. So free their minds, let them have a fresh look on Monday, hear the closing arguments, hear the jury instructions, and then deliberate. But I think the judge is in a tough spot. I mean, there's no perfect decision, but I think it's probably best for the jury to make an intelligent decision if they want to be there and they don't feel forced to be there away from a holiday weekend.
All right, excellent. Appreciating our legal analyst, Leland Holbert's time. As always, appreciate it, Leland. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome back. Before we go, of course, want to express gratitude for the input from our reporter down in Bowling Green from Molina and our legal analysis from our attorney Leland Holbert. A reminder, you can always follow along the live blog that goes into much more minute details of all the statements made in court that applies to the testimony, and you can, of course, follow it from all the way down to the very start of this trial. So a reminder that lives on our live blog on wave3.com. And you can, of course, double check on all the big headlines. Is the story we're going to be looking at tonight, of course, the confirmation here of Misty Knoll and her prison sentence there. A reminder, you can always scroll down to the different tabs and check in on the latest updates, local and national headlines, of course. All right, that's going to do it for us at 8:45. A reminder, you can always check in with us if you want to reach out, if there's a story of particular interest to you, wanting to connect on something that's happening, where you live in your neck of the woods, and we have a team ready to send out to connect with you. Doing so on Wave Now through our Smart TV app, and of course, all of our different social media channels, YouTube, Twitch, X, Facebook. Trying to make sure we're here to offer that opportunity to dive into those stories and headlines as well. As always, appreciate your time, folks. Looking ahead to tomorrow, of course, some of us are working and others, will be able to enjoy the holiday. So if you are, do so safely, enjoy it, stay hydrated, and keep yourself protected from the sun, of course, just enjoying this long weekend ahead on the 4th of July. Appreciate your time, folks. So have a good one.